What up boys, and welcome back to another tech video. This week I asked you guys on the community tab for specific topics and details you want me to cover in this week's tech video. Now, after actually having finished this script by the time I'm saying this, we've come up with a ton of ideas to make an extremely long tech video. So if you do end up enjoying today's video, or just appreciate the effort that went into this gigantic masterpiece, then be sure to drop a subscription onto the channel for more content that shows you the greatest Clash Royale strategies. Anyway, Graveyard has been a sort of dead card, pun submitted by Determined Games, for a little while now. But because of a certain balance change to Barb Hut and Zappies, Graveyard has seen a rise in popularity. Let's start with the basics of this card. It spawns 16 skeletons overall, although the card and the Clash wiki say anywhere between 15 to 20 skeletons, but I always count 16 whenever I try. The Graveyard seems to have a 2-second deploy time where it spawns no skeletons, and then spawns one every 0.5 seconds from there on in. Unfortunately, the DPS stats for this card are nowhere near consistent due to the Graveyard's random nature. The card attempts to spawn skeletons around its edge, but it's completely random in how it does so. This makes Graveyard sort of difficult to talk about. Overall, the Graveyard can come to a total of 1072 DPS onto your tower with all the skeletons spawned and tanked for. However, you're obviously going to counter this card, and the spawns are random, so the DPS is actually sort of immeasurable. Let's just say it's a lot of damn DPS if you don't answer it. Alright, so this is probably the part of the video where your Graveyard play is really about to change. I tested 7 different Graveyard placements, 5 times each, and noted down how much damage each placement dealt. Interestingly or not, placing as much of your Graveyard's edge onto the tower deals the most damage, which probably makes sense considering the game tries to spawn the skeletons around the edge. Your Graveyard will average 50 more damage when placing it higher up, but that was only over 5 placements, and King Tower activations are more common higher up, so you probably just want to place it further down in fact. The further down placement is the one I've actually been trying to use this entire video, just so you guys get accustomed to it if you didn't already know it. In my testing, placing the Graveyard dead centrally onto the tower activated the King Tower on 4 out of 5 occasions, and led to it dealing the least damage of any test. Interestingly, I did start to notice a trend between True Red and True Blue. I wasn't initially recording the damage numbers from either True, but True Blue actually averaged 100 more damage than True Red did. You can probably just play this down to my sample size only being 5, but it was a noticeable trend within my results. This placement on screen right now is really the only one you want to be using for Graveyard. It's the most optimal for damage without really risking your King Tower. But with all that said, that's all for my testing. Let's get into the strategy portion of this video. We'll kick off this video with some synergies for the Graveyard so we understand what sort of card it is. Obviously, this card has become a win condition. People used to think it would have defensive usages, but really, it's not worth spending 5 elixir on a skeleton army, so it's only ever used on offense. The first card that comes to mind when I think of Graveyard synergy is Ice Golem. Being a 2 elixir card with substantial HP, it is the perfect punish play option. It will let the skeletons spawn freely whilst only costing you a total of 7 elixir. However, some decks will want to run a mini tank that can also play defense. A lot of Graveyard decks overall like these more counter-attacky cards. For this role, I like to call upon the Knight. He's a very similar card to the Ice Golem, but just offers you a sturdy defensive option whenever you may need. These two both fit into cycle decks quite well, but if you're not trying to run a fast-paced Graveyard deck, then Cannon Cart is a very threatening but heavier option for your deck. The beauty of Cannon Cart comes in its range and DPS. Your opponent has to not only answer the 5 elixir Graveyard, but also a threatening 5 elixir Cannon Cart at the river. Having to spend twice means their defenses have to be split, and they're more suspect to an incoming poison. Another ranged 5 elixir unit that Graveyard decks like is the Bowler. Yeah, a weird one. As I mentioned before, Graveyard likes these defensive type cards that can counterattack and tank. The Bowler is perfect for this. Whilst he's defending, he's constantly pushing away units from him and preserving his own health. This preserved health can then be used to tank for a Graveyard and cause your opponent a ton of troubles, especially if the Bowler obtained a load of positive elixir trades too. Graveyard also pairs well with the Barbarian Hut, as we mentioned at the start of this video. First of all, the waves of barbarians will act as a HP pool for the Graveyard to spawn into. Secondly, it's poison bait. If your opponent uses a poison on a Barbarian Hut to weaken it, your Graveyard is now free from poison interference. The small spells in Graveyard are either Log, Barb Barrel, or Arrows. Barb Barrel gives you that extra mini tank in spell form, but not every deck needs this. Arrows gives you another spell that counters air units, but it costs an extra elixir, and Log is really the best for spell cycling if your graveyard is countered in any matchup. My personal favourite is Log, but the other two are viable if you're more comfortable with them. As for big spell synergies, you're choosing from Poison or Freeze. Freeze gives you a higher risk, higher reward deck, whereas Poison is the mainstream option. Freeze is only really good when you know your opponent is out of elixir, and you'll definitely take their tower by playing Freeze. Cards like Archers, Minions, or General Swarms are one of the free card types you want to look out for in your opponent's deck when you're playing Graveyard. When you have an elixir advantage, you want to be using your Poison spell on these troops to enable your graveyard to run absolute riot on your opponent's tower. If you don't have that elixir lead, you can still use Poison on this if you know that your opponent doesn't have other counters in hand. If the hand is Minions, Golem, Inferno Tower, and Mini P.E.K.K.A, using your Poison onto these minions isn't the worst idea because you have an almost guaranteed ton of damage. Other cards you want to watch out for are tanky splashes. These are things like Valkyries, where they shouldn't be poisoned, but will take out your skeletons quickly due to their splash damage. Your best strategy here is to put your graveyard more centrally onto the tower. The Valk splash damage can't be utilised if the skeletons are all spread out. However, this sort of placement is riskier for King Tower activation, so do be careful with this. If you're running Freeze, that is a very good counter to Valkyrie, as long as you're not overcommitting. If you don't like those first two options, all you can really do is outcycle the Valkyrie and hope to catch your opponent off guard. The undoubted best counter to Graveyard is also its best synergy, Poison. When facing a Poison deck, your opponent is most likely going to want to keep their Poison spell in hand to counter your graveyard. Your best option here is to pack another damage threatening card that is vulnerable to Poison. I'm thinking the likes of Barb Hut or Magic Archer. These cards force your opponent to choose and give you the ability to adapt your game plan. If they continue to counter your graveyard with Poison, you can now stack Magic Archers or Barb Huts to get damage. If they change their Poison focus onto Barb Huts or Magic Archers, you'll be able to get damage with your graveyard. Graveyard being run with Poison bait is one of the 3 suitable options for this win condition, but we'll get into those later. Let's talk more in depth about a Poison bait graveyard deck now. As you can see on screen, these decks tend to run 2 Poison bait cards alongside their graveyard. In this example, those are Barb Hut and Ewiz. The Poison and Log are the spells of choice, with Skeletons and Mega Minion to help the deck cycle and defend. Your main offensive threats are an Ice Golem and Graveyard Punish, or a Barb Hut spam that your opponent simply cannot deal with. As we just discussed, these decks thrive by setting up poison traps for their opponent to fall into. Once they do, the Graveyard and Ice Golem come out to quickly dish out damage onto the tower. These decks often play like Predator vs Prey, just waiting for the best time to pounce onto the tower. The second solid Graveyard setup is something we briefly mentioned before, Splash Yard. This list focuses on obtaining defensive value to counterattack and also obtaining splash value, as you can tell by the name. These cards are primarily Bowler and Baby Dragon, which pair greatly with Tornado for this aforementioned value. Poison and Log are the spells of choice again, with Skeletons letting the deck cycle to its crucial cards. The quick push here changes to Knight and Graveyard, because Knight gives better defensive capabilities to the deck than Ice Golem does. I mean, look at this list. If it didn't have a Knight, then its ground defense is pretty flimsy. This deck gets around having to poison bait by overrunning the opponent with Elixir. Chewing up a huge push with Bowler, Baby Dragon and Tornado gives you a huge counterattacking threat that your opponent might not be able to defend, even if they do have the poison ready in hand. And finally, we have Cycle decks. These have fallen out of favour since Graveyard first came out, but are still a viable choice in my books. It's fairly obvious what they try to do. They use the low elixir count and cheap cards to spam as many graveyards as they can, hoping the graveyard's RNG will get them substantial damage, and it's a fairly valid tactic. Relying on RNG is something neither you nor your opponent can control, but with enough attempts you'll be sure to get enough damage over time. The Knight and Ice Golem combine in this deck to always give you a mini tank in hand for when a graveyard opportunity presents itself. The Archers and Tesla take main defensive duties, whilst Poison and Log do their things as spells again. This deck is able to get around Poison by outcycling it over and over again, and always having one of those 2 mini tanks in hand to push in with a graveyard. So really, those are the 3 main tactics to getting damage with Graveyard against Poison. You can bait the Poison using Poison Bait, you can outcycle the Poison using a Cycle deck, or you can overrun your opponent with an Elixir lead that means your push is too big for them to simply kill with a Poison using Splash Yard. Your starting play of a Graveyard deck entirely depends on what playstyle you're going for. If you're playing poison bait, you want to try playing really early with one of your bait cards in order to screw them up with their spell cycle. Playing Splash Yard, you sort of want to wait to get defensive value, but maybe only for a minute. Then you should be looking to play a non-committing card in the back like a Knight or Baby Dragon, and then respond to your opponent's plays. And then with a cycle deck, you want to just cycle. Get playing as soon as you can, just in case they're a beatdown deck. This way you can play more graveyards over the course of the match, which is your ultimate goal. With this cycle deck style, you're pretty much always going to be punishing rather than investing. But Graveyard itself doesn't always have to be a punish play. Against decks like Miner or Hog Rider, you'll actually want to counter-attack. This is Graveyard's version of investing. Play units on defense to defend your opponent's win condition, and then attack once their win condition is out of hand. In matchups against heavier win conditions, as the rules of punishing and investment go, you want to punish most of the time. See a big beefy golem in the back? Get punishing, kiddo, because this is your time to shine. Again, punishing and investing changes for Graveyard. It's more about punishing or counter-attacking. If your opponent's win condition is cheaper than Graveyard, try to play counter-attacking. If your opponent's win condition is more expensive than Graveyard, try to punish whenever they play it. Simple. Now let's outline a few matchups and what you should be doing as a Graveyard player. Let's start against Graveyard itself. Always keep your poison for their graveyard, try to use your skills such as baiting or outcycling to catch them without a poison, but primarily make sure they can't get damage with their graveyard. Play as many graveyards as you can for damage. Against log bait, you really want to be pushing into any investment bait cards they play, and if you see a princess in the back, go with graveyard and poison. You get free elixir of value onto their princess and get a poison lasting on their tower. Keep your small spell for their win condition, of course. Bridge spam is a weird matchup really. You can defend their spam cards really easily, so their correct play is to build a bigger push around a P.E.K.K.A. in the back. Don't panic, keep your P.E.K.K.A. counters for this, and punish as soon as they play it. It's the rule of 7 elixir in the back, punish. Expo is a harder matchup because a defensive Expo really ruins you. Try to keep your tanky units in hand and don't really focus on playing graveyards. You really just want to poison cycle their defensive Expos down and win that way. And with this, make sure you don't give them spell value, make sure you're blocking all Expos, and make sure you're never playing graveyards into a defensive Expo. Golem we sort of outlined before, but keep looking for pressure against Golem. Golem in the back, pressure. Night Witch in the back, pressure, so they can't put a golem in front of her. Keep going for these aggressive plays to stop their investment. And finally, Free Musketeers. Keep your poisons for their musketeers and play for Graveyard Chip. If you have Splash Yard, you can get away with playing a bowler onto the muskets instead. If they ever play Free Muskets in the back, Graveyard and Poison, same as against Princess. Free Musketeers and Princess are 2 investment cards you can graveyard into, however there are a load. Anything that's weak to poison and relatively slow is a good idea to punish with a poison graveyard push. The frequency of which you do this depends on your deck, however. A cycle deck will do it every single time, a poison bait deck not so much, and a Splash Yard deck almost never. Real quick, let's talk about countering Graveyard. I want to go over this briefly because we've discussed a ton of counters in this 200-hour-long video already. The best counter in the game, as we know by now, is Poison. Counters Graveyard without your opponent being able to interfere, is a positive elixir trade, and minimizes any damage taken. Carry a Poison at all times during a Graveyard meta. Your next best counters are going to be Swarm cards, however these are weak to the Graveyard's Poison synergy. The sheer number of bodies in the Graveyard spawn area prevents the skeletons from getting any damage. Tankier splashes are also on this level in my opinion. They'll soak the damage for your tower whilst fighting off skeletons in the process. Those 3 categories are good counters, whilst things like Knights and Bandits aren't too great but can be used in a pinch to solely soak damage. Outside of that, the only tips I can really give is to act fast. Placing before the Graveyard's 2-second spawn period is over gives you a huge advantage. Also, don't forget units attacking from the river. These are killer if you overcommit onto defending the Graveyard itself. If you can, try to block mini tanks at the river before they come onto your side if you think your opponent is setting up a Graveyard push. Usually you want your Crown Tower to help out against this mini tank, but it's actually better for the Crown Tower to be focused on the skeletons rather than the mini tank against Graveyard. Try to learn the skill against Graveyard decks. Finally, Tornado. Graveyard is near useless once your King Tower is active, so using a Tornado to activate this King Tower is priceless. Against a Graveyard in the most efficient tile, you just can't throw random tornadoes to activate the King Tower. The placement is nearly impossible to get down, so I actually wouldn't advise trying to activate the King Tower against this. A more central plant is a lot easier, and is worth attempting if you've mastered the placement. Overall, it's just an extremely high risk, high reward play that should only be attempted if you're extremely confident in your ability and if your opponent isn't using an anti-tornado spot. And finally, the outro. Damn, this has to be actually like double the length of any tech video I've done to date. Like, this is 15 minutes of scripted content. Just as a personal shout out, if you did enjoy today's video and do want more content like this, drop us a subscription because it really does mean a lot. Anyway, I wanted to end off by discussing some balance changes. Graveyard has been a really strong or super in limbo card. It's been sorta dead recently, with a Barbarian Hut and Zappies bringing it back to life. And this is where the problem lies. Graveyard, along with Three Musketeers in my opinion, has to be fundamentally weak by itself in order to be balanced. Sounds weird, but when you couple these cards with their spell-based synergies, they become stronger and hence balanced. The strength of Barb Hut makes Graveyard stronger, even if Graveyard itself is weak. And such, we end this video by saying, Graveyard is actually really weak right now, and I wouldn't recommend playing it, and I've just spent 72 hours on this video for absolutely no reason. But with all jokes aside, Graveyard is actually quite strong now due to its synergies, and if Supercell aren't happy with that, then they need to focus on the support rather than the card itself. But yeah, boys, that's all I have for the Graveyard today. If you want to leave a comment about this card down below, I'll be sure to answer it within the coming days. Thank you all for watching this far, lads. I hope you did enjoy, and peace.